Feldwebel Klaus Richter pressed his palms against the cold metal railing of the USS Wakefield, watching the American coastline materialize through the Atlantic fog. 23 days had passed since his capture in Sicily. 23 days of uncertainty, fear, and propaganda-fueled expectations. Behind him, 1,847 German prisoners stood in tight formation on the converted luxury liner's deck, their gray uniforms salt-stained and wrinkled, their faces hardened by 3 years of Mediterranean combat. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Richter witnessed through the lifting mist would shatter every certainty the Wehrmacht had drilled into him since 1936. The harbor sprawled before them like a metal forest, cranes, derricks, and loading equipment stretching across miles of waterfront. But it wasn't the industrial scale that struck him motionless. It was the workers. White Americans operated massive cranes alongside Negro laborers. Women in work clothes directed cargo movements with the same authority as men. A group of teenagers, boys and girls together, sold newspapers and coffee at a nearby dock entrance, laughing and joking as if mortal enemies weren't disembarking 50 meters away. "Das ist unmöglich," Richter whispered to Lieutenant Werner Hoffmann beside him. "This is impossible." Hoffmann, a decorated officer from the Afrika Korps, simply stared, his tactical mind struggling to process what contradicted 4 years of military intelligence briefings about American weakness, racial chaos, and imminent societal collapse. Richter would later document this precise moment in his journal, seized by American military intelligence in 1944 and declassified in 1993. The journal, now preserved in the National Archives, contains one of the most detailed personal accounts of German prisoner psychology during their first encounters with American society. In neat, dramatic script, he wrote, "We expected to find a nation tearing itself apart. Instead, we found organized chaos that somehow functioned better than our own rigid order." The scale of Boston Harbor exceeded anything the German military had constructed in occupied Europe. Naval intelligence reports from August 1943 documented that this single American port facility processed more tonnage in a week than the entire German naval infrastructure handled in a month. Richter counted 37 ships being loaded or unloaded simultaneously. In Hamburg, Germany's largest port, 6 ships working at once constituted a major operation. But numbers alone couldn't explain the psychological impact. What truly destabilized the arriving prisoners was the casualness. No military parades, no demonstration of strength, just Americans working with the relaxed efficiency of people who knew they'd already won, even though 2 years of war remained ahead. A brass band played swing music near a war bond rally station. Civilians wandered within sight of military vessels. A hot dog vendor sold food to dock workers and off-duty sailors alike, operating a small business within what should have been a secured military zone. Street vendors hawked newspapers with headlines visible to enemy prisoners. "Production targets missed in Detroit," and "Congress questions Pacific strategy." In Germany, such public criticism during wartime meant immediate arrest. Here, it was capitalism and democracy functioning normally. The 1,847 prisoners of the 305th Panzer Grenadier Division stood at attention on American soil for the first time, their formations perfect despite exhaustion. They had survived North African deserts, Sicilian mountains, and Atlantic storms. They expected to face harsh conquerors. They expected prison camps matching the brutal efficiency of German stalags. They expected, at minimum, the cold professionalism of military detention. What they encountered, instead, was Processing Station Baker, a temporary facility established in a converted warehouse near the harbor. And with it came the first of many impossibilities that would accumulate into complete ideological transformation. American soldiers directed the prisoners into formation using adequate German, not shouted commands, but clear instructions. Several American officers spoke fluent German, their accents revealing university education rather than military necessity. Captain Jonathan Bradford, whose service record indicated a Ph.D. in Germanic languages from Yale, addressed the assembled prisoners in perfect Hochdeutsch. Genten, Sie sind nun Kriegsgefangenen der Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika. Unter der Genfer Konvention von 1929 haben Sie spezifische Rechte, die Ihnen voll erklärt werden. Sie werden mit der gebundenen Würde Militärpersonals behandelt. Sie werden medizinische Versorgung erhalten, angemessene Nahrung und humane Unterkunft. Bitte alle Fragen oder Bedenken und der richtigen Kanälen werden behandelt. The word dignity hung in the humid August air. Richter had processed Soviet prisoners in 1941. The concept of dignity hadn't entered the equation. Prisoners were logistical problems to be managed with minimum resources. The Geneva Convention was theoretical paperwork, not operational reality. Yet here stood American officers with clipboards, not whips. They were checking names against lists, verifying identities, asking about wounds or medical conditions. A Jewish American sergeant, his name tag read Goldstein, distributed Red Cross packages while explaining in German that kosher meals were available for any Jewish prisoners who required them. Several younger prisoners laughed nervously, thinking it was mockery. Sergeant Goldstein didn't smile. He simply repeated the information, adding that a rabbi would be available for religious services if requested. The laughter died immediately, replaced by confused silence. German military doctrine held that Jews controlled America through manipulation and corruption. Yet here was a Jewish soldier in American uniform offering religious accommodation to enemies. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and profound.
Medical inspections began within an hour of landing. German military physicians, now prisoners themselves, assisted American medical personnel in examining each man. The medical tent, hastily erected near the processing area, contained equipment that astonished the German doctors. Dr. Friedrich Weber, a Stabsarzt, staff surgeon from the 305th Division, later testified to Red Cross inspectors that the field medical station contained diagnostic equipment superior to permanent German military hospitals. X-ray machines, sterilization equipment, and pharmaceutical supplies, including the miracle drug penicillin, still rare in German military medicine, were deployed for routine prisoner processing. American medics worked alongside Negro medical corpsmen. Several German prisoners visibly recoiled when African-American personnel approached to administer injections or draw blood. In Nazi Germany, such racial contact was legally prohibited, morally condemned, and culturally unthinkable. Lieutenant Bradford noticed the reactions. He didn't reprimand the prisoners, he simply stated in German, "In the United States Army, medical personnel are selected by skill, not race. You will be treated by whoever is on duty. This is not negotiable." The statement itself was revolutionary. American authority based on competence rather than racial hierarchy contradicted every speech Hitler had made about inferior peoples and superior German bloodlines. Wounded prisoners received immediate attention. Private Joseph Kruger, who had sustained shrapnel wounds during his capture in Sicily, was transported to Boston Naval Hospital for surgery within 3 hours of landing. Swiss Red Cross observer Dr. Hans Müller documented this case in his September 1943 report. German prisoner received surgical treatment identical to American military personnel, including anesthesia, blood transfusion, and post-operative care in a ward shared with American sailors. The concept of shared medical facilities between enemies exceeded Geneva Convention requirements. It exceeded human logic to warriors trained in total war ideology. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared the prisoners for their first American meal. The mess facility occupied another converted warehouse, its interior lined with long tables and benches. As prisoners filed in under guard escort, they passed American sailors eating their own meals. The two groups, mortal enemies who had been trying to kill each other in convoy battles and North African campaigns, would eat in the same building. Not in separate rooms, not in different shifts, simultaneously. Americans at tables on the left side, Germans on the right, sharing the same serving lines, receiving the same food. Richter stood frozen in the doorway, his military training scrambling to classify this situation. In every prison camp scenario he'd studied, prisoners ate separate rations, inferior food, subsistence calories. The Geneva Convention required adequate nutrition, but adequate meant survival, not equality. The serving line moved efficiently. American mess personnel, including several women in Women's Army Corps uniforms, served food onto metal trays without distinction between American and German personnel. The portions were identical. The menu, documented in Quartermaster Corps records from August 17, 1943, included roast beef, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, fresh bread with butter, apple pie, coffee, and milk. The meal totaled approximately 2,800 calories. By comparison, German military rations in 1943 provided 2,200 calories on the front lines, dropping to 1,500 in rear areas. German civilian rations, when available, barely exceeded 1,000 calories daily. But calories alone couldn't explain the psychological impact. It was the quality. The beef wasn't preserved meat or tinned rations. It was fresh, properly cooked, still warm. The bread wasn't the dense black bread of German rations, but soft white bread, each man receiving as much as he wanted. Butter, not margarine or ersatz substitutes, real butter. The apple pie proved particularly devastating to morale. Dessert for prisoners of war exceeded even propaganda's wildest claims about American waste and decadence. Several men stared at their pie slices without eating, convinced it was mockery or psychological manipulation. Then, they watched American sailors throw away partially eaten portions because they were full. Food simply discarded because men had eaten enough. The casual abundance of waste exceeded German comprehension. Richter forced himself to eat slowly, maintaining discipline. The food was real, nutritious, plentiful. Around him, younger prisoners wept quietly while eating, their first adequate meal in weeks, combining with exhaustion and confusion to break military composure. At the far end of the hall, a radio played, not military announcements or propaganda broadcasts, but a baseball game. American sailors listened attentively to the play-by-play, occasionally cheering or groaning at game developments. They paid more attention to baseball than to enemy prisoners eating 50 feet away. The message was clear, though unspoken. You are not important enough to fear. We are so secure in our victory that we can ignore you while following sports. For professional soldiers trained to see themselves as elite warriors of a master race, this casual dismissal proved more psychologically damaging than any interrogation technique. The train journey from Boston to Camp Reynolds, Oklahoma, began on August 19, 1943. Unlike the cattle cars used for prisoner transport in Europe, American authorities provided actual passenger coaches, not luxury accommodation, but standard railway cars with cushioned seats, windows that opened for ventilation, and functioning toilets. The psychological impact of traveling as passengers rather than cargo was immediate. Guards remained present but relaxed, reading magazines or playing cards rather than maintaining constant vigilance. Several spoke basic German and answered questions about what prisoners could expect at their destination. But the real shock came from what the trains passed through, and more importantly, what American authorities made no attempt to hide. Industrial facilities that should have been camouflaged operated in plain sight. The General Electric plant in Lynn, Massachusetts, displayed its name in enormous letters visible from the train. The parking lot contained hundreds of workers' personal automobiles. Workers owned cars. This single observation contradicted years of propaganda about American economic collapse.
As the train traveled through Connecticut, prisoners observed the Pratt & Whitney aircraft engine plant in East Hartford. No attempt at concealment, no security paranoia. Just industrial production operating openly with shifts changing in full view. Workers entered and exited carrying lunch pails, wearing wristwatches, driving personal vehicles. Lieutenant Hoffman, maintaining his role as senior officer, attempted to count aircraft engines visible in staging areas. He stopped after reaching 47, realizing that this single facility produced more aviation engines in a month than Germany's entire industry. Night brought even more startling revelations. Unlike Germany's strict blackout regulations, American cities blazed with electric lights. Street lamps illuminated every corner. Residential areas glowed with lights in every window. Neon signs advertised businesses. Movie theaters, restaurants, and shops operated normally with exterior lighting that would have brought immediate Gestapo raids in Germany. The energy expenditure for purely civilian purposes exceeded German military consumption. This wasn't just abundance. It was abundance so extreme it was treated as normal, unremarkable, beneath notice. At Philadelphia's 30th Street station, documented in Pennsylvania Railroad records, the train stopped for refueling and water. The platform was shared with civilian travelers. German prisoners watched American families saying goodbye to soldiers heading for training camps. Women kissed husbands in public displays of affection that would be considered improper in German culture. Children ate ice cream cones despite sugar rationing. Teenagers crowded around a jukebox, feeding it coins to play swing music. The mixing of military and civilian life, the public affection, the casual consumption during wartime, all of it contradicted totalitarian assumptions about necessary sacrifice and collective discipline. One American soldier, noticing German prisoners staring, approached the window. He wasn't hostile, just curious. Through a guard who translated, he asked where they were from. When told, North Africa, he nodded sympathetically. Rough place to fight. At least you're safe now. Then he returned to his family without another thought. The concept that safety could be found in enemy hands, that capture might be relief rather than humiliation, was utterly foreign to Wehrmacht psychology. German soldiers fought to the death specifically to avoid capture by enemies they'd been taught would torture and murder prisoners. Yet here was an American soldier casually acknowledging that German prisoners were safe now in American custody, as if their well-being was simply assumed, not questioned. Camp Reynolds occupied 940 acres of Oklahoma prairie, approximately 60 miles southwest of Tulsa in Creek County. Established in February 1943, it was designed to house 5,200 German prisoners. When Richter's group arrived on August 23, 1943, after a 4-day train journey, they expected barbed wire, guard towers, and harsh conditions meeting minimum Geneva Convention standards. What they encountered defied every expectation of military imprisonment. The camp's perimeter was secured with standard barbed wire fencing and guard towers, meeting security requirements. But inside that perimeter existed something unprecedented in German experience. A prisoner of war facility that resembled a small American town more than a military prison. Wooden barracks, painted white, stretched in neat rows, each building designed to house 40 men in individual beds, not bunks. Each barracks contained flush toilets, shower facilities with hot water, electric lighting, and heating stoves for winter. Windows had screens to keep out insects. Floors were wooden, not concrete or dirt. The camp layout included administrative buildings, multiple mess halls, a fully equipped hospital, recreation halls, a canteen operating as a store, workshop facilities, an outdoor theater, sports fields, and even a small chapel available for religious services of multiple denominations. Swiss Red Cross inspector Dr. Heinrich Bauer conducted his first inspection of Camp Reynolds in September 1943. His report, preserved in International Committee of the Red Cross Archives in Geneva, stated, "Camp Reynolds exceeds Geneva Convention requirements in every measurable category. Accommodations are superior to many German military barracks. Medical facilities equal civilian hospitals. Food provisions exceed minimum caloric requirements by substantial margins." The camp commander, Colonel Robert Callahan, whose military service record documented extensive experience in logistics and personnel management, addressed arriving prisoners through interpreters. His message was straightforward and completely unexpected. "Gentlemen, you are prisoners of war, but you are also human beings protected by international law. You will be treated according to Geneva Convention standards, which means with dignity and fairness. Within this camp, you will largely govern yourselves. You will elect spokesmen from your ranks. You will organize your own activities, manage your schedules, and maintain your own discipline under our oversight. We will provide security, supplies, and medical care. How you live within these boundaries is substantially your own choice." Self-government for prisoners of war seemed like either weakness or elaborate deception. In German prisoner camps, every moment was controlled, every action supervised, every decision made by captors. The suggestion that enemies would be trusted to manage their own affairs within a prison camp violated basic security logic. Yet within days, it became operational reality. Prisoners held elections for compound spokesmen. They formed committees for recreation, education, and internal discipline. They organized sports leagues, music groups, and language classes. American authorities provided resources and oversight, but allowed prisoners substantial autonomy. The camp hospital stunned German medical personnel. Dr. Weber, the captured German physician, was given a tour by American medical staff. The facility contained X-ray machines, surgical suites with modern equipment, dental offices, a pharmacy stocked with medications including penicillin and sulfa drugs, and examination rooms that exceeded German civilian hospital standards. When Dr. Weber expressed disbelief at the equipment quality, the American chief medical officer, Major Thomas Reynolds, replied through an interpreter. "The Geneva Convention requires adequate medical care. We interpret that as the same standard we provide our own soldiers. These men are prisoners, not animals." The casual assertion of prisoner humanity, stated as obvious fact rather than generous policy, represented a philosophical chasm between American and German military cultures.
Nothing symbolized the cognitive dissonance more perfectly than Camp Reynolds' prisoner canteen. Located in a dedicated building near the center of the compound, it operated as an actual store where prisoners could purchase goods using scrip, military payment certificates earned through voluntary labor programs. The concept itself seemed insane to military minds. Prisoners earning wages? Prisoners making purchases? Prisoners exercising consumer choice while in captivity? Yet there it stood, shelves stocked with items that German civilians couldn't obtain. American cigarettes, chocolate bars, soap, shaving supplies, toothpaste, writing paper, envelopes, books, magazines, musical instruments, art supplies, sports equipment, playing cards, and even small luxury items like hair tonic and aftershave. Prisoners could browse, select items, make purchases, and return to their barracks with personal property. The American logic, documented in War Department policy memos, held that maintaining prisoner morale through small comforts reduced escape attempts, improved cooperation, and minimized security incidents. German military doctrine held that deprivation built character and maintained proper prisoner submission. The American approach, using comfort to ensure compliance, seemed backwards to every principle of military discipline. But it worked. Escape attempts from Camp Reynolds totaled 7 during its entire operational period from 1943 to 1946. All 7 were recaptured within days. The successful escape rate was 0%. Richter purchased his first items on August 28, 1943, using scrip earned from 5 days of voluntary labor in camp maintenance. He bought American cigarettes, writing paper, and a small notebook. In his journal entry that evening, he wrote, "Today I went shopping. I am a prisoner of war, and today I went shopping. Nothing in 4 years of military service prepared me for this impossibility." The impossibilities were accumulating. Each small contradiction, decent food, humane treatment, self-governance, commercial transactions, combined into a larger realization that everything they'd been taught about America was wrong. But the transformation had only begun. The real ideological earthquake would come through labor programs, civilian interactions, and exposure to American society functioning normally despite total war. Those revelations would shatter not just military discipline, but the entire Nazi worldview that had justified the war itself. The transformation didn't announce itself with dramatic revelations. It crept in through accumulated observations, small contradictions that compounded daily until the entire Nazi worldview collapsed under the weight of American reality. Feldwebel Klaus Richter had survived the initial shock of arrival, the abundance, the humane treatment, and the impossible luxuries of prisoner life. But survival and understanding were different things. In his journal entry from September 3, 1943, he wrote, "We have been fed, housed, and treated better than we treated ourselves in barracks. Yet this generosity feels more dangerous than any interrogation. It asks questions our ideology cannot answer." The questions were about to multiply exponentially. By October 1943, severe labor shortages across American agriculture and industry led to the War Manpower Commission to authorize German prisoner employment in non-military sectors. The program, coordinated between the Provost Marshal General's Office and state agricultural boards, offered prisoners voluntary work assignments with compensation of 80 cents per day in canteen scrip, the same base pay as American Army privates. The voluntary nature itself was revolutionary. In German labor camps, work was mandatory, brutal, and unpaid. Here, American authorities asked for volunteers and paid them market wages. Richter volunteered immediately, not from ideological cooperation, but from crushing boredom and curiosity about American agriculture. On October 12, 1943, he and 47 other prisoners boarded trucks heading to the Whitmore Ranch, a 340,000-acre cattle operation near Pawhuska, Oklahoma. What they encountered there would begin the systematic demolition of Nazi agricultural theory. The ranch foreman, Samuel Tucker, whose family had operated the property since Oklahoma statehood, treated German prisoners as temporary employees rather than enemies. Ranch employment records from October 1943 show that Tucker assigned prisoners to actual cattle work. He herded, branded, fence repair, and equipment maintenance. The scale alone defied European comprehension. The Whitmore Ranch covered more territory than many German counties. A single American ranch family, with hired help, managed an operation that would require a collective farm system in Germany.
But scale was just the beginning of agricultural impossibilities. The mechanization stunned every prisoner with farming experience. Trucks, not horse-drawn wagons, transported supplies and personnel across the vast property. Tractors pulled equipment that did the work of 50 men. The ranch even used a small civilian aircraft, a Piper Cub, for aerial cattle surveys, spotting strays across terrain too vast for ground observation. Lieutenant Werner Hoffmann, who had managed his family's 200-acre farm in Bavaria before the war, watched the Piper Cub take off for morning ranch surveys. In a letter to his family, intercepted and copied by military censors before being forwarded through the Red Cross, he wrote, "Father, they use aircraft for cattle herding. Small civilian planes, privately owned by ranchers. The American farmer flies his own airplane to check his livestock. I no longer understand what wealth means." The ranch employed a mixed workforce that contradicted every Nazi racial theory. White American cowboys worked alongside Mexican vaqueros and several Creek Nation Indians. The work assignments showed no racial hierarchy. Skill determined responsibility, not blood. Tucker's son, James, a 17-year-old too young for military service, supervised several work crews, including German prisoners. The casual authority of an American teenager directing veteran Wehrmacht soldiers created cognitive dissonance that Richter documented extensively. "Today I took orders from a boy, not a military cadet or Hitler Youth with ideological training, but a ranch boy who learned cattle work from childhood. He corrected my fence repair technique patiently, showed me the proper method, then moved on without asserting dominance or requiring submission. He treated teaching as normal, not as power over enemies. I don't have words for how this changes everything."
The prisoners witnessed American agricultural abundance that seemed deliberately wasteful by German standards. At one documented incident in November 1943, Tucker discarded several hundred pounds of cattle feed because moisture had caused minor mold in one corner of the storage shed. The feed was still 95% usable by German standards, but American safety protocols required disposal. German soldiers who had seen their comrades starve in Russia watched American ranchers destroy food that would have sustained battalions. The casual destruction of abundance hurt more than scarcity ever had. By December 1943, harvest season required maximum labor deployment. Richter's work assignment shifted to the Henderson cotton gin in Bristow, Oklahoma, 15 miles from Camp Reynolds. Cotton processing provided the next level of industrial education for Wehrmacht prisoners. The Henderson facility, operating 24 hours during harvest season, processed more cotton in a single day than German textile mills handled in a week. Modern equipment separated, cleaned, compressed, and bundled cotton at speeds that seemed impossible without mechanical breakdown. But the machinery wasn't what transformed prisoner understanding. It was the workers. American cotton gin employees took regular breaks, 15 minutes every 2 hours, mandated by labor regulations even during wartime peak production. They ate full lunches in a dedicated break room. They listened to radio programs while working, music and news broadcasts playing constantly over facility speakers. They discussed politics openly, including criticism of Roosevelt's agricultural policies without fear of consequences. Plant supervisor Richard Henderson, whose grandfather had founded the facility in 1897, treated German prisoners as temporary seasonal workers. He explained operations, demonstrated equipment safety, answered questions about processing techniques. Several times, he asked prisoners for suggestions about efficiency improvements, actually listening to their responses and occasionally implementing proposed changes. The concept that enemy prisoners' opinions might have value, that defeated soldiers could contribute ideas worth implementing, violated every hierarchical assumption of military culture.
On December 18, 1943, Henderson brought his 8-year-old daughter to the facility during school vacation. She wandered through the operation, greeting workers, including German prisoners, completely unafraid. Her father saw no danger in his daughter's proximity to enemy soldiers. The trust was absolute and unconscious. Richter watched the child approach a group of prisoners during break time, offering homemade cookies her mother had baked. The prisoners, hardened combat veterans, accepted cookies from an American child whose country they had tried to destroy. Several men's hands shook as they took the offered treats. "We are supposed to be enemies," Richter wrote that evening. "Yet today a child gave us cookies, and grown men who survived Africa and Sicily cried, because kindness is more destructive than any weapon we faced in combat." The Christmas season of 1943 at Camp Reynolds and throughout Creek County became the psychological turning point for most prisoners. What happened that winter contradicted every principle of wartime behavior, every assumption about enemy treatment, every lesson learned from 4 years of Nazi indoctrination. The transformation began in early December when local churches approached camp authorities requesting permission to include German prisoners in Christmas celebrations. Colonel Callahan, after consulting with the War Department, approved supervised participation in religious services and community events. The Bristow Methodist Church, documented in church records preserved by the Creek County Historical Society, invited German prisoners to Christmas Eve services. Reverend Thomas Morrison, whose son was serving with the Marines in the Pacific, personally extended the invitation through camp interpreters. On December 24, 1943, 47 German prisoners under light guard escort attended Christmas Eve services at Bristow Methodist. They sat in pews alongside American families whose sons, brothers, and fathers were fighting Germans in Europe. Nobody objected. Nobody protested. Several families welcomed prisoners with handshakes and Merry Christmas greetings in broken German. The church choir performed traditional German Christmas carols, Silent Night and O Tannenbaum, in phonetically learned German specifically for the prisoners. American mothers whose sons were in combat zones sang Christmas songs in the enemy's language to comfort enemy soldiers. Richter sat in the third pew, surrounded by Americans at war with his nation, listening to them sing his childhood Christmas songs. When the choir reached the third verse of Silent Night, he broke. Tears came unbidden, unstoppable. Around him, other prisoners wept openly, not from homesickness alone, but from the complete destruction of ideological certainty. How can we hate people who sing our songs to comfort us? How can we believe in racial superiority when they show more humanity than we ever did? Every Nazi speech, every propaganda film, every promise of Aryan dominance collapses against the simple fact that our enemies are better people than we were taught to be. The Christmas celebration at Camp Reynolds itself is extensively documented in local newspapers and military records. The Bristow Record published a detailed account on December 30, 1943, describing community-wide efforts to ensure prisoners had a proper Christmas. Local families donated 5,200 individual gift packages, one for every prisoner in camp capacity. Each package contained cigarettes, candy, soap, writing materials, and a handmade Christmas card, many from local school children. The messages was simple: Merry Christmas, peace on earth, hope you can go home soon. The American Legion Post in Bristow, veterans of World War I who had fought Germans in the Argonne and Belleau Wood, donated sports equipment, musical instruments, and funds for a special Christmas feast. Men who had shot at Germans 25 years earlier now gave presents to current German enemies. The generosity transcended logic. The Christmas tree in the main compound stood 40 feet tall. cut from Oklahoma forest and transported to camp by volunteer labor. It was decorated with electric lights that burned continuously, using more electricity than small German villages had for all purposes. The display would have been criminally wasteful in Germany. Here, it was normal holiday celebration.
The Christmas feast, documented in Quartermaster Corps records, exceeded anything prisoners had experienced even in peacetime Germany. The menu included roast turkey, 1¼ pounds per man, honey-glazed ham, sweet potato casserole, green bean almondine, cranberry sauce, cornbread dressing, dinner rolls with butter, mincemeat pie, pumpkin pie, ice cream, beer for enlisted prisoners, and California wine for officers. The meal totaled approximately 5,500 calories per person. Meanwhile, German civilian rations in December 1943, when available at all, provided barely 1,000 calories daily. German soldiers on the Eastern Front, if they were fortunate, received 1,800 calories. But numbers couldn't capture the psychological impact. It was the care, the obvious effort, the community mobilization to ensure that enemies, people whose comrades were killing American soldiers in Europe, had a memorable Christmas. American civilians whose sons were dying in Italy made certain German prisoners were comfortable and happy. The moral inversion was total and devastating. Private Joseph Kramer, a 21-year-old from Munich who had believed every word of Mein Kampf, sat at Christmas dinner surrounded by abundance while knowing his family in Germany faced starvation. In a letter home that passed through Red Cross channels, he wrote, "Mother, we eat like kings while you starve. The Americans defeated us not with weapons, but with generosity we cannot comprehend and do not deserve. I am ashamed of every belief I held, every speech I cheered, every certainty I possessed. We were wrong about everything." Working in American communities exposed German prisoners to racial dynamics that fit no propaganda narrative. The reality was more complex than Nazi claims of racial chaos or American assertions of democratic equality. At Camp Reynolds, African-American soldiers from the 758th Tank Battalion occasionally rotated through guard duty assignments. German prisoners, products of intensive Nazi racial indoctrination, found themselves taking orders from Black American soldiers. Several prisoners initially refused, requesting transfers, rather than submit to what they called racial humiliation. Colonel Callahan's response, documented in camp discipline records, was direct and uncompromising. "You are prisoners of war under American military authority. American military personnel of all races will supervise you according to duty assignments. Your racial opinions are noted and completely irrelevant. Any further refusal to follow lawful orders will result in disciplinary action." The orders stood. German prisoners took instructions from Black American guards or faced solitary confinement. Most complied, discovering that orders from Black soldiers were no different than orders from white soldiers, professional, clear, and backed by legitimate authority. But prisoners also witnessed segregation's contradictions and hypocrisies. They could eat in Bristow restaurants that refused service to the Black soldiers guarding them. They could attend movies at theaters where African-American guards couldn't sit in the main section. German enemies had more social freedom in some contexts than American citizens whose only crime was skin color. This paradox, being treated better than some Americans while being enemies of America, shattered simplistic racial ideologies from both directions. Nazi theories of racial hierarchy collapsed against Black Americans' demonstrated competence and dignity, but American claims of equality rang hollow against visible segregation. Richter documented this confusion extensively. "We were taught that racial mixing causes national weakness, yet America fights the strongest war in history with a mixed population. We were taught that inferior races cannot contribute to civilization, Yet Negro soldiers guard us competently. Negro medical personnel treat us professionally. Negro workers operate complex machinery efficiently. Our theory says they cannot do these things. Reality says they do them daily. But America segregates them despite their capabilities, which contradicts American theory of equality. Both ideologies seem half true and half false, leaving me with no certainty about anything. At agricultural work sites, prisoners labored alongside Mexican-American field workers and several Native American employees. The efficiency of integrated work crews, when focused on tasks rather than race, demonstrated that productivity came from competence and motivation, not racial purity. German prisoners picked cotton alongside workers of multiple ethnicities. The Mexican-American crew leaders consistently outperformed German workers in speed and quality. Native American equipment operators handled complex machinery with greater skill than German mechanics. Every day contradicted assumptions of Aryan superiority. In January 1944, prisoner Hans Dietrich, a committed Nazi Party member before the war, worked alongside a Cherokee Nation mechanic named William Blackbear at a farm equipment repair facility. Blackbear taught Dietrich advanced engine repair techniques with patient professionalism. In a moment Dietrich later described to educators, Blackbear casually mentioned he held a mechanical engineering degree from Oklahoma State University. The realization that a man Nazi ideology classified as subhuman had university education superior to most Wehrmacht officers broke something fundamental in Dietrich's worldview. He stopped wearing his Nazi Party pin that day and never put it back on. What prisoners experienced as generous treatment and voluntary education was actually a sophisticated psychological operation. Declassified documents from the Special Projects Division, now available in National Archives Record Group 389, revealed the extent of deliberate re-education efforts. The program, initiated in mid-1943 and expanded throughout 1944, identified 3 categories of prisoners through careful psychological screening: convinced Nazis, approximately 15%, non-political prisoners, roughly 75%, and active anti-Nazis, about 10%. The screening process was subtle and comprehensive. Camp authorities analyzed prisoners' reading choices from libraries, their reactions to news of German military defeats, their participation in educational programs, their social interactions, and their expressed opinions in letters and conversations. Weekly reports tracked ideological shifts across the entire camp population. Anti-Nazi prisoners identified through this screening received additional privileges, educational opportunities, and leadership positions. They became barrack spokesmen, discussion group moderators, and newspaper editors. Their influence on non-political prisoners was carefully cultivated and monitored by specially trained personnel.
The camp library at Reynolds grew from an initial 400 donated books to over 6,000 volumes by spring 1944. The collection included works by German authors banned by the Nazis: Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, and works by Jewish authors like Lion Feuchtwanger and Stefan Zweig. A German prisoner could read books in American captivity that would have meant death to possess in Nazi Germany. The cognitive dissonance of greater intellectual freedom as an enemy prisoner than as a German citizen was profound and deliberate. Oklahoma State University, working with the War Department, provided correspondence courses to prisoners. University records show 428 German POWs enrolled in courses including English language, American history, mathematics, agricultural science, and mechanical engineering between 1944 and 1945. Professors visited Camp Reynolds monthly to conduct lectures and examinations. The camp newspaper, Der Pod, The Path, was published weekly by prisoner editorial staff. Early editions from late 1943 contained subtle Nazi propaganda and party-line interpretations of war news. By mid-1944, the tone had shifted dramatically toward democratic discussions, philosophical debates about governance, and critical analysis of totalitarian systems. This evolution wasn't accidental. American authorities provided carefully selected reading materials, facilitated discussions on democratic principles, and enabled prisoner debates on political philosophy, all while maintaining the appearance of prisoner autonomy and free expression. Major David Armstrong, executive officer for the re-education program at Camp Reynolds, wrote in an April 1944 classified report, "The transformation rate exceeds projections. Approximately 65% of non-political prisoners show measurable movement toward democratic ideals after 8 months of exposure to American society and targeted education. The key is making them believe they're reaching these conclusions independently. Direct propaganda would trigger resistance. Lived experience combined with access to information produces genuine ideological evolution." The sophistication of the program extended to controlled exposure to American media. Prisoners had access to American newspapers that criticized the war effort, revealed military setbacks, and questioned strategic decisions. Radio programs in recreation halls broadcast news that included both military successes and failures, political debates, and even comedy programs that mocked military leadership and government policies. To men raised under totalitarian information control, the concept of free press criticizing national leadership during wartime seemed like societal suicide. Yet America's war efforts strengthened despite, or perhaps because of, open debate and criticism. The 1944 presidential election campaign, observed from prison camps, provided the ultimate demonstration of democracy's strength. Roosevelt faced serious challenge from Thomas Dewey while the nation remained at war. Republicans criticized military management, newspapers published opposition viewpoints, political cartoons mocked the commander-in-chief, congressional debates about war strategy were broadcast publicly. Yet, military operations continued. Production increased. The war efforts strengthened. Democracy functioned through apparent chaos, proving that open discourse created resilience rather than weakness. The abstract statistics of re-education success are illustrated by specific cases documented in military records, personal memoirs, and post-war interviews. Klaus Richter arrived at Camp Reynolds in August 1943 as a loyal Wehrmacht NCO, skeptical of propaganda but fundamentally convinced of German cultural superiority. His transformation occurred gradually through accumulated observations documented in his journal. The turning point came during Christmas 1943, but the process continued through 1944. By June 1944, his journal entries had shifted from descriptions of American strangeness to critical analysis of Nazi ideology. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, he wrote, "Today the invasion began. In previous years, I would have cheered for German victory. Now I hope for quick Allied success so this terrible war can end and Germany can begin becoming what it should have been, a democracy among democracies, not a tyranny among nations." Richter returned to Germany in April 1946 as part of repatriation programs. He settled in Frankfurt, worked as a civil administrator during American occupation, and advocated publicly for democratic reconstruction. In 1952, he published his memoir, Gefangen in Amerika, Prisoner in America, which became influential in shaping West German understanding of American values. He immigrated to the United States legally in 1957, became a naturalized citizen in 1962, and worked as an industrial engineer for Ford Motor Company until retirement in 1985. He maintained correspondence with families from Bristow, Oklahoma for 43 years until his death in 2001 at age 84. Werner Hoffman escaped from Camp Carson, Colorado in July 1945,
not from mistreatment, but from fear of returning to destroyed Germany. His escape was meticulously planned, but psychologically conflicted. He lived under the assumed name William Harper in Denver for 9 years, working as a bookkeeper, marrying an American woman, and raising 2 children who knew him only as their American father. In 1954, consumed by guilt about living a lie, he voluntarily surrendered to federal authorities. FBI investigation revealed he had broken no laws except illegal presence. He had paid taxes under his false identity, maintained legitimate employment, and lived as a model citizen. Immigration authorities granted him permanent resident status based on good conduct. He became a naturalized citizen in 1960. In his 1968 memoir, Enemy Turned American, Hoffman wrote, "I escaped not because I was mistreated, but because I couldn't bear returning to Germany's ruins when America offered everything we had destroyed. I wanted to be part of the nation that showed me what civilization means. My greatest shame is living a decade as a lie. My greatest pride is becoming an American in truth." Josef Kramer never returned to Germany. His story represents the most complete transformation from enemy to American. After repatriation to Germany in early 1946, Kramer lived in the devastation of Munich for 3 years. He worked with American occupation authorities as a translator and administrative assistant, witnessed the Marshall Plan rebuilding effort, and watched democratic institutions slowly take root in German soil.
In 1949, he applied for immigration to the United States under German refugee provisions. His application included letters of recommendation from Colonel Callahan, Reverend Morrison, and Samuel Tucker, all people he'd met as a prisoner in Oklahoma. He immigrated legally in 1950, settled in Tulsa, worked in oil industry accounting, married an American woman, and raised 4 children. He became a naturalized citizen in 1955. His children and grandchildren knew his history. He never hid his past as a German soldier and prisoner of war. In 1984, at the 40th anniversary reunion of Camp Reynolds prisoners, Kramer spoke to local reporters. "I came to America as an enemy, believing in racial superiority and totalitarian destiny. I left as a friend, understanding that democracy's apparent chaos is its greatest strength. I returned as an immigrant, knowing this was always meant to be my home. America defeated me in war, but won me through peace. That victory matters more than any battlefield." The German POW experience in America represented more than individual transformations. It was a systematic program that shaped the reconstruction of post-war Germany and the development of the Atlantic Alliance. The numbers document the program's scope and success. Of 425,000 German prisoners held in the United States between 1943 and 1946, only 2,222 escape attempts occurred, 0.52% of prisoners. Only 54 successful escapes lasting more than 30 days, 0.01%. Documented sabotage incidents, 7 confirmed cases, 0.001%. Work refusals, 178 documented incidents, 0.04%. Voluntary labor participation, 87% of eligible prisoners. Post-war surveys conducted by American occupation authorities in Germany found 74% of returned POWs held favorable views of American democracy. 61% supported Marshall Plan aid when announced. 55% advocated for German-American alliance. 38% expressed desire to immigrate to America. 23% maintained active correspondence with American families. Immigration records show approximately 5,000 former POWs legally immigrated to America during the 1950s. Naturalization records indicate 92% became citizens within the eligible time frame. Their American success rate, measured by employment stability, homeownership, community integration, and lack of criminal records, exceeded general immigrant populations.
The influence of returned POWs on West German Reconstruction is documented in occupation records and German historical archives. Former prisoners occupied significant positions in the new German democracy. 48 became Bundestag, or parliament, members. 312 served as mayors or city councilors. 1,847 worked in agricultural modernization programs. 2,341 taught in reconstituted German schools, and 4,165 managed businesses using American management methods. Their influence extended beyond formal positions. Returned POWs became informal advocates for democracy, explaining American systems to skeptical Germans, vouching for American intentions, and facilitating cultural understanding between former enemies. Hans-Georg von Studnitz, a former prisoner who became an influential German industrialist, told American historians in 1965, "We returned from America with more than memories. We brought knowledge of how democracy functions in practice, how free markets operate efficiently, how diverse peoples cooperate productively. We had seen the future, and we knew it worked. Our testimony helped convince Germans that American occupation aimed at partnership, not punishment." Camp Reynolds itself closed in December 1945 as repatriation programs returned prisoners to Germany. The facility was dismantled, the land returned to agricultural use. Today, only a historical marker near Bristow commemorates the site where 5,200 enemy soldiers learned that democracy could defeat ideology without destroying humanity. But the connections endured far beyond camp closure. The Bristow Heritage Society maintains extensive archives of correspondence from former POWs spanning 5 decades. Christmas cards arrived annually from Germany and from former prisoners who had immigrated to America. Wedding announcements, birth announcements, and eventually obituaries documented lives transformed by an unusual prisoner experience. In 1984, at the 40th anniversary reunion of Camp Reynolds prisoners, 63 former Camp Reynolds prisoners returned to Oklahoma. The Bristow Record covered the reunion extensively. Former enemies embraced former guards. Wehrmacht veterans placed flowers at the American Legion Memorial honoring Bristow's war dead. Men who had fought against America publicly thanked America for teaching them what their own nation had failed to demonstrate. Fritz Zimmermann, speaking for the group at a public ceremony, said, "We came as enemies, believing in racial superiority and national destiny. We left as friends, understanding that democracy's chaos is its strength, that diversity creates rather than weakens society, that generosity is power's highest expression. We defeated you in war, but won us in peace. That victory changed not just our lives, but the trajectory of our nation. We are forever grateful." Historians have extensively analyzed the German POW experience in America, producing scholarship that confirms both the scope and its significance. Arnold Kramer's Nazi Prisoners of War in America, 1979, provides comprehensive documentation of camp operations and prisoner treatment across all facilities. Judith Gonsberg's Stalag USA, 1977, analyzes the re-education program's psychological operations and effectiveness. Antonio Thompson's Men in German Uniform, 2010, examines POW labor programs and their economic impact. Ron Robbins' The Barbed Wire College, 1995, details educational transformation and intellectual awakening among prisoners. The scholarly consensus holds that American treatment of German POWs represents history's most successful large-scale re-education program. The success came not through propaganda or indoctrination, but through lived experience. Prisoners witnessed democracy functioning, experienced human dignity in practice, and observed that American values, however imperfectly implemented, produced better outcomes than totalitarian alternatives.
The transformation occurred because America didn't just defeat Germany militarily, it demonstrated superiority of values, systems, and fundamental human decency. The sites that stunned German prisoners weren't elaborate deceptions or propaganda operations, they were simply American life, messy and imperfect, but fundamentally free.
German POWs expected to find weakness, racial chaos, and societal collapse. Instead, they discovered a nation so confident in its power that it could afford mercy to enemies. They expected harsh treatment and found generous hospitality. They expected to be hated and found themselves included in Christmas celebrations. They expected to be exploited and were paid fair wages. They expected propaganda and received access to free press. They expected indoctrination and received education that enabled independent thinking. Every expectation was inverted. Every certainty was challenged. Every Nazi teaching was contradicted by observable reality. The unusual sights German prisoners witnessed in America: abundance treated as normal, diversity functioning as strength, criticism of leadership coexisting with national unity, enemies treated as human beings, were unusual only to eyes trained by totalitarian ideology. To American eyes, these were simply ordinary life. But ordinary American life proved more revolutionary than any propaganda could be. Democracy's power lay not in perfect execution, but in self-correction. Not in suppressing criticism, but in incorporating it. Not in enforced uniformity, but in managed diversity. Not in demanding submission, but in earning cooperation. The German prisoners came as enemies convinced of their superiority. They left as advocates for values they'd tried to destroy. Many returned to Germany to build democracy from ruins. Others immigrated to America, becoming citizens of the nation they'd once fought. Their transformation wasn't betrayal of Germany, but redemption of what Germany could become. They hadn't abandoned their homeland. They discovered what their homeland had abandoned in embracing Nazism. The sites that shocked them in 1943 became the foundations they built upon in Reconstruction. The kindness they received as enemies became the model for how they treated others as citizens. The democracy they witnessed in practice became the system they implemented in theory. America's greatest World War II victory wasn't on any battlefield. It was in prison camps, where enemies became friends, where warriors became citizens, where hatred transformed into understanding, where defeat became education. The unusual sights German POWs witnessed in America changed individual lives, reshaped a nation, influenced a continent, and demonstrated that humanity's highest achievement isn't destroying enemies, but transforming them into allies through the simple, revolutionary act of treating them as human beings deserving of dignity. Those sights, shocking to totalitarian minds, but ordinary to free peoples, proved that democracy's greatest weapon isn't military force, but moral example. That civilization's highest expression isn't perfect order, but respectful chaos. That victory's truest form isn't domination, but transformation. The German prisoners who reached America between 1943 and 1946 came expecting to witness a nation's weakness. Instead, they witnessed its strength. They came prepared to endure captivity. Instead, they experienced transformation. They came as enemies. They left as witnesses to democracy's power not just to win wars, but to win hearts, minds, and futures. That transformation, multiplied across 425,000 individual prisoners, helped create the post-war world, the Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan, the democratic reconstruction of Germany, and ultimately the peaceful integration of former enemies into a community of free nations. The unusual sights German POWs witnessed in America became the foundation of the world we inherited. Their transformation from enemies to advocates proved that humanity's greatest victories come not through destruction, but demonstration,
not through hatred, but through humanity, not through propaganda, but through the simple, powerful truth of lived democratic values.